In July of last year, Christy Baumer drove her Beamer, that sounded so much better in my head, in a parking garage in Austin. And she climbed to the 7th floor and she found a parking spot. And as she squeezed her car into that parking spot, instead of pressing the brake, she hit the accelerator. And her 300 horsepower BMW flew through the cables and down to the street. She survived it, which should probably make this a good commercial for BMW. But she sued the operators of the garage structure for $1 million. In September of '92, Stella Liebeck stopped at a drive-through window for a McDonald's to order her coffee. She got her coffee, she put it between her legs, she opened the lid to put sugar and milk, and that's when she spilled it on herself, suffering third-degree burns. She sued McDonald's for $3 million. But my personal favorite, in May 5th of 2005, Roy Pearson went to the local dry cleaner to pick up his pants. As it turns out, the dry cleaner lost his pants. That's Pearson's pants. The pants were part of a suit that was worth $1,000 new. So Pearson sued them for not $54,000, $54 million. In fact, he started by suing for $67 million, which he reduced to $54 million. He lost that case, but during that case, the dry cleaner offered him $3,000 to settle it. Remember, the suit only cost $1,000. He declined. So he offered $4,600. He still declined. Then the dry cleaner offered $12,000 to settle that lawsuit, and Pearson still declined. Why would the dry cleaner offer $12,000 to settle a suit over a $1,000 suit? Because it cost him $83,000 to win this case and get nothing. The first step in solving any problem is recognizing there is one. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a culture of litigation. The US ranks 24th in reading, 24th in science, 38th in math, 13th in problem solving. Of all the things that we could lead the world in, we lead the world in the percentage of our GDP that we spend on civil litigation. The US spends 1.7% of our GDP on civil litigation. The next country, Canada, spends 1.2%, UK 1%. The European Union average is 0.63%, and Japan spends 0.3%. It gets even worse when you look at dollars, because we spend as much as Canada, the UK, the entire European Union, and Japan spend on civil litigation combined twice. We spend $956 per person per year on civil litigation. And just to put this number in perspective, there are 28 countries in this world that don't make $956 per person in GDP. But why does it matter? See, last year, at the beginning of the school year, the chief diversity officer in Clark University in Massachusetts told the freshmen in their orientation meeting that this school will not tolerate microaggressions. When asked, what do you mean by microaggressions, she said, for example, you cannot use the phrase, you guys, because obviously that's highly offensive to women. They also coined the terms trigger warnings and safe spaces. Ladies and gentlemen, we are raising a generation that is not ready to face life. And why? Because our schools are afraid of getting sued. Next time you walk into a doctor's office or a hospital, you should know that 79% of doctors say that they order tests they don't need just to avoid lawsuits. 45% of US hospitals don't have enough ER doctors because they are afraid of lawsuits. And as you go to get employed somewhere, remember that there are equal opportunity employment laws that make it so hard for you to fire a substandard, a bad employee, if that employee is a woman, old, or a member of a minority group. And they make it so hard to fire them that employers don't want to hire them. But don't worry, that's not what they're going to tell you. they will tell you that we decided to go in a different route with this position because they're afraid of getting sued. So we do live in a culture of litigation. What if I could show you that this culture of litigation starts with an event that happened one evening almost 50 years ago? It is based on research that I've conducted using credible sources such as the Census Bureau, World Bank, the American Bar Association, and the CIA. Okay, mostly credible sources. First of all, could we have too many lawyers? And I know there is a lawyer joke in here, I just don't have it. Well, as it turns out, 80% of the world lawyers live here in the US. That's 1 in 244 people. 1 in 13 in Washington, D.C. In fact, 41% of our members of Congress hold a law degree. To understand why we have so many lawyers, I started tracking the growth in the number of lawyers compared to the growth in general population. The graph behind me will show you that between 1900 and 1970, the growth in the number of lawyers pretty much tracked the growth in general population. In fact, for every 1% growth in general population, the number of lawyers grew 1.1%. But something happened, and in 1970, that growth in the number of lawyers surged. And starting in 1970, for every 1% growth in general population, the number of lawyers grew 7%. So it seems like we have too many lawyers. But what happened in 1970 or before 1970? For that kind of surge to happen in 1970, something must have happened in the 60s. Well, the 60s were crazy times. JFK was elected and then assassinated. His brother Robert was assassinated, and so did Dr. Martin Luther King. We went through the ecology revolution, the feminist revolution, black power revolution, human rights revolution, sex revolution, and drug revolution. On July of 1969, we put a man on the moon. And in August, we had Woodstock. We didn't trust the government, and we were fighting a war that we didn't want. And what made it worse was that during the Korean War, only 3 million households here in the US had a TV. But by 1969, more than 60 million US households were watching the Vietnam War on TV. That year, 1968, reached the peak of our involvement in Vietnam. We had 536,000 soldiers in Vietnam. 300,000 were drafted that year. But the worst part was the 16,899 who came home in a casket covered with the American flag. So if you were a draft-age man, you did not know that the next year those numbers are going to go down. In fact, you had absolutely no reason to believe that those numbers are not going up. And so you experienced a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And if you don't know what it feels like, uncertainty, ask yourselves, how do you like the uncertainty of the weather? How about financial uncertainty? How about the uncertainty of serving in a war, and even worse than that, coming home in a box covered with the American flag? Most countries have volunteer military. 34 countries in the world actually have a military that's drafted. Israel is one of them. That's me, serving in the Israeli Defense Forces 35th Airborne Paratroopers Brigade. I knew that my service was coming, and I enlisted when I was 17 and a half. I joined the military 1 month after the war in Lebanon in 1982 started. I know the fear that people would feel before going to war. But what made it worse here was the uncertainty. You see, you did not know if you were going to serve in Vietnam. So I want to take you to the evening of December 1st, 1969. At that point, somebody was drawing blue capsules out of a big drum, corresponding to dates, birth dates, and the numbers 1 through 366. The chart is what you see on the right. The columns are the months, the rows are the dates. Find your birthday. Find your lottery number. The first number to be drawn was September 14th. If you were unlucky enough to be born on September 14th, you were the first to go to Vietnam. What was your number? What we found in the research was that every man who had a draft number lower than, let's say, 200 remembers this night as if it happened yesterday. Those with higher numbers or those who enlisted may not remember it. And we did an experiment. A friend of mine asked a friend of his, just sent him a text. What was your lottery number? Nothing else, no content, no what lottery are you talking about? Yet his friend knew exactly what we were asking. And he replied within less than a minute with the number 27. And then he said, everybody knows their lottery number. It was actually a pretty scary time. We watched that war on TV, and we were all worried. So the event that changed our culture is the draft lottery of December 1st, 1969. Now, don't get me wrong. The 60s led to this. There are a lot of things that happened in the 60s that led to this, but that one event did change our culture. It created fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But we still have one box missing. You see, you could have legally avoided the draft if you were a true conscientious objector, if you had a real medical or psychological condition that prevented you from serving, if you were a homosexual or a woman, neither of which were drafted, if you had an essential civilian job or simply had children. Those were all valid legal reasons not to serve. Then, of course, came the illegal reasons. You could have faked documents, lied, cheated, fled to Canada. But that was illegal. Then, of course, you could have simply been eligible. You're at the right age with absolutely no condition that prevents you from serving in Vietnam. In this case, my friends, you are going to Vietnam. Unless you had a high lottery number. Because in the December 1st, 1969 draft, they only reached number 195. You could have enlisted. 75% of our soldiers in Vietnam were volunteers. And the only deferment that still existed in December of 1969 was the college deferment. It was a classification of 2S, that's a real document. And with that, if you registered for college, you could avoid being drafted until the age of 35. And to put it in perspective, the war was over by 1973, so effectively, you will not serve. So now we have the college deferment, but how does that link to having too many lawyers? So I did more research, and here's what I found. I looked at the number of men enrolling into law schools. Between 1947 and 1968, between 18,000 and 22,000 enrolled into law schools. The numbers actually peaked at 23,000, but then declined to 22,000 by 1969. The number of women that enrolled into law schools by 1965 was the first year that more than 8,000 women enrolled in law schools nationwide. But then came the draft. And the number of men enrolling into law schools spiked. And we went from 22,000 to 32,000 in the span of 2 years, 45%. We never reached that number of men in the red line enrolling into law school until today. We are still not there. In law schools, there were 110 law schools in 1947, 200 today. The single one-year jump, biggest jump, 1969. And in order to keep the capacity filled, they started reducing admission requirements. And more women started applying, just so that law schools can keep themselves at full capacity, capable of delivering 45,000 new lawyers every year. And that caused a surge in the growth in the number of lawyers, which give us a culture of litigation. Thank you.